first off, thank you again for joining us. I promise to give you most of your most of your Friday back. I know that to get started in the weekend. But before we get started with our questions, I just want to do a round of introductions. I'll start and then we'll just popcorn it. So, my name is Ashley Thurston. I am the Communications Director for Represent Women, and I'm super excited to join this call and be able to talk to you both. I'll send it over to Fatma really quick.
So, hi, I'm Fatma Tawfi. I am Represent Women International Research Manager. I am currently located in Cairo, Egypt, and I am also responsible for Gender Parity Network for Represent Women, where we have advocates for gender representation and everything from all over the world. One of her or them will be joining us today, Georgina from Mexico, actually.
Okay. Jennifer.
Hi, so I'm Jennifer Piscopo. I'm a professor of politics and gender at Royal Holloway University of London. So I'm joining today from London, and I study women's representation in Latin America, including in Mexico. So thanks so much for inviting me.
Awesome. And Catherine.
Hi, I'm Catherine Reyes Householder. I'm an assistant professor at the Political Science Institute at the Catholic University in Chile. I'm also an associate researcher at the Center for Social Conflict and Cohesion Studies. I work on gender in the presidency, how women win presidential elections, and how they use their presidential power once they're elected.
All right. Thank you all. Fatma is going to start us off. She's going to ask a couple of questions and then we'll float to me. And then when we have our other caller, she's going to ask a couple of questions to end us off. All right. I'll send it to Fatma.
So first, what have been the greatest challenges and opportunities for electing more women in Mexico, and how have that changed over time?
I'm so sorry, Fatma. Let me close. I know you're recording, but we're all working from home. So let me just close my window, actually, because a very loud truck went by as you spoke. We're all happy because it's finally warm enough in the UK to have our windows open, but then we occasionally get drowned out. I'm so sorry. Could you repeat the first part of your question?
What have been the greatest challenges and opportunities for electing more women in Mexico, and how have they changed over time?
Great, thanks. So I'll jump in and talk a little bit on the Mexican case in particular. So we can think about Mexico also situated in the Latin American context. And so starting in the 1990s, Latin American countries began adopting what were then called gender quota laws for women candidates. So these were laws that required political parties to run certain proportions of women. And in the 1990s, these laws were typically set at 30 or 40%. So Mexico was one of the early adopters of one of those gender quota laws. And initially, right, they had these lower thresholds and they often contained some loopholes that would allow political parties to get out of complying with the law and not having to run the exact specified percentage of women. So that was an early challenge, but the laws did result in electing some women, and women discovered that one of their common interests across political parties, because of course women represent distinctive ideologies, they don't always agree on everything, but that initial generation of women that was elected under the gender quota laws, despite the loopholes and despite some of the obstacles with early implementation, discovered that a common interest was working together to make these laws more effective, to make them stronger, because stronger and more effective laws would benefit women no matter their ideology, right? Because all women wanted more opportunities within their political parties. So over time, the loopholes were closed. These thresholds of 30 to 40% were raised to gender parity, which is why now in 2024, we talk less about gender quotas. We talk more about gender parity, because most countries are setting their gender quota laws to be at 50% for women and 50% for men. So Mexico went through a really incredible process of strengthening its 30% gender quota law to 40% and then to gender parity. And then in 2019, adopting a constitutional reform called Gender Parity in Everything, which requires gender balance in the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branches at the federal, state, and municipal levels. Now, this constitutional reform does not apply to a unitary office like the presidency, right? It applies to Congresses, top positions in ministries, right? Political positions that you can divide 50-50, right? And have women and men holding those offices in equal numbers. But that legacy has been very important for how Mexico eventually set up a race for the presidency that was between two women. Now, there was a third party in the race that fielded a male candidate, but he was never polling at more than 10%. So the race was really between the two women running from, on the one hand, the governing coalition, and on the other hand, the opposition coalition. And so even though gender parity didn't directly affect their nomination, and I want Catherine to talk a little bit more about how women do get these nominations for the presidency in Latin America, there is now a decades-long legacy of Mexican voters seeing women in very important political positions, thanks to gender quota and thanks to parity. And even more importantly, the political parties, once forced to nominate and run women, undergo a learning process, right, where they realize that actually women are competitive candidates. Women can win competitive races. So in Mexico, they were winning in single member districts, they were winning governors' races, and that voters will actually vote for women, right? And so political parties, become more open to women as candidates thanks to this process. So I'll stop there and let Catherine jump in.
Thanks, Jen, for all of that. Yeah, I tend to think of, the presidency, it's the most difficult kind of power for women to obtain and arguably the most important. As Jen was saying, these quotas don't apply generally to presidential elections, in part because you can't divide the office, right? And so while gender quotas have been enormously helpful in helping women overcome obstacles, right, to become candidates and to win office, they generally don't apply to the presidency. So the main obstacle doesn't happen on election day, right? It happens months before the election, and it happens at these presidential nominations. So across the region of Latin America, most of Latin America has presidential regimes. They hold presidential elections. And about 10% of the presidential candidates tend to be women. And women tend to win, about 7% of these elections. But women have more narrow routes to the presidency than men do. So women have won the presidency 11 times now in Latin America. And they win three ways, basically. The first way it happened with Viola de Chamorro, right, in Nicaragua in 1990, when she leads a major coalition against the Sandinistas and Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. And she did this by putting together, a major coalition. Well, actually, the coalition came together and they asked her to be their nominee. And then we had the next presidential victory in Panama, right, with another major political party in Panama challenging the party in power and seeking to displace them. So women can win through seeking to displace an incumbent. And this happened again in Honduras, right, more recently with Xiomara Castro. But really the most common way for women to win the presidency is through these incumbent parties. So we start seeing that with Bachelet in Chile in 2006. She wins through an incumbent party. Then Cristina Fernandez does so. Then Laura Chinchilla does so in Costa Rica, and then Dilma Rousseff does so in Brazil. And Sheinbaum clearly is another example of this. And women have won re-election 3 times as well in Latin America. So the real question is, how do they become nominees of these major coalitions, these major parties? Because they've never won the presidency through new parties or small parties. Men have, right? We see that happen a lot actually in Latin America of men. Alberto Fujimori in Peru in the 1990s, Hugo Chavez, Javier Milei in Argentina, Bolsonaro in Brazil. There are a lot of times men take these real small or new parties and they end up winning presidential elections. Women don't do that. They basically win through major parties. So the key obstacle, going back to your question, is how do they get these nominations from these major parties? And there's different mechanisms that parties use to choose their presidential candidates. Sometimes they have primaries. And women can win primaries. Women have won primaries. I don't see that as necessarily a major obstacle. But what happens with presidential primaries a lot of times is that it's actually the elites that are influencing the primaries, even though it's the voters who actually go to the ballot box, right? It's really important, having the support of a major male in particular. They tend to be men, leader of a party or an incumbent president supporting you in that. But sometimes women become candidates just because there's sort of a consensus among elites and parties that this person should be the candidate. And the mechanism in Mexico is actually a little bit interesting, and probably Jen could talk more about this, where they use surveys in order to determine which candidate would be the most popular. So the conventional wisdom, right, is that the president of Mexico strongly supported Claudia Sheinbaum, and that allowed her to become the candidate. But they did have a sort of a mechanism of surveys that they conducted that she emerged as the strongest candidate in that sense. So really, there's many different ways to become candidates in terms of the mechanics behind it. The key here is understanding, what are the incentives that can lead these party elites, these outgoing presidents to back a woman, right? And so here, there's lots of research in the broader field of women in politics that Jen has certainly contributed to as well, that women tend to be associated, women in presidential politics in general, tend to be associated, with novelty, with change, with modernity and feminine leadership, as well as moral integrity. And there's different reasons for those associations, but one of the particularities, right, of presidential politics is that because there's so few women, having a woman can sort of signal a novelty, and that she's going to bring change. And so women may be able to signal both policy continuity and symbolic change. And when party elites and outgoing presidents and party selectors think that they need those kinds of qualities in order to win the next election, or to pursue to enhance their legacy as outgoing presidents, and pursue their policy agendas later, then they might have incentives for selecting a woman.
So that's such an interesting conversation, and you just replied to our next two questions, I think, as both of you. But yeah, as we were just talking about Canada selection in Mexico and the role of political parties, I wanted to know how receptive were the political parties for the gender quota laws that were introduced to Mexico?
Yeah, so I think that's a question that gets asked a lot, right? Is sort of trying to understand the role of male resistance and male elites, right? Because historically, men are the leaders of political parties, men hold the top positions in political parties, the selectors, right? Political scientists talk of the selectors, who really chooses the candidates. As Catherine said, sometimes voters might be voting in a primary, but there are party elites that have already signaled to voters who their preference is, right? This is certainly the case in Mexico, right? AMLO signaled very early on that Claudia Sheinbaum was his preference, even though there was a party primary using this survey mechanism. So we tend to think about these elites, right, as being mostly men. So why is it that they support women? And so in my work, I really emphasize the story of quotas evolution, as I did in the beginning, because it's sort of technically fascinating. If you want to geek out about electoral law, I know at Represent Women, you think a lot about how electoral rules help or harm women, but it's also an important part of the story of male resistance, right? Because these first gender quota laws in the 1990s were hard fought by women in political parties, but they also were not very strong. Right. And so that was actually an incentive for male elites to vote for them in the moment, because there becomes a moment where, as I've said in my work, that the men could get all the public relations benefits of seeming to support women, because, you've just passed the 30% gender quota law. At the same time, in the nitty gritty, there's all these little loopholes So they know that in practice, right, they might not have to follow the rules. And so then the story, right, is that the women, once a small cohort of women is elected, they work collaboratively to try to close those loopholes. And if I can speak a bit informally, to really stick it to the men over time, right? So this is actually, you know, when we talk about quota evolution, that is an important part of the story. There are cases, but they are fewer, where a country adopts gender parity right away. Right? In the vast majority of cases, not just in Latin America, but globally, because of course, gender quotas were not just a Latin American phenomenon, although they originated there, right? But in the vast majority of cases, there is an evolution where an initial weak law becomes a stronger law over time, right? So you have to gradually accustom parties to the new rules, right? Gradually accustom them to think about opening up political power, opening up political opportunities to women, and then you can make them stronger. So that is an important part of the story.
Okay, thank you for that. Ashley, do you have a few questions for them?
Yes, I do. Thank you so much. Catherine, I wanted to lean more into your work and I wanted to ask you to explain more about the concepts of gendered incentives and perceived potential. If you can explain more about those, please.
Catherine, you're muted.
Sorry. Sorry. This is a concept that I think is useful when we're talking about how women become candidates, presidential candidates in particular, but you can sort of apply it to more broadly beyond just presidential candidacies. And again, Jen's work speaks to this as well. It's sort of a community of scholars, right, that have, I think, contributed to this idea. But when we think of, you know, party selectors, they have certain goals, right? And I guess the most obvious goals that we can think about is they want to win the election. Okay, so electoral goals are obvious. But there's also sort of goals of, you know, building the party brand or building the party reputation. And then if you're and so you want a candidate who maybe can not only win the election, but also sort of help improve the party brand. And then if you're a party selector, you know, sort of thinking about who do I want to support for as my successor, and you're an outgoing president, then you're also really concerned about your legacy, right? And so we see presidents want to improve their legacy, not only to domestic voters, right, but also to the international community. So there's different sort of rational calculus that goes behind deciding which candidate to support. And party selectors tend to think that they should differentiate based on the kind of traits that these candidates convey, because it's these traits they think that's going to allow them to win the election. It's these traits that they can convey that can allow them to build the party brand and improve their legacy. And so they are concerned about which potential candidates can convey desirable traits to voters, convey desirable traits as well to the international community. So these party selectors are rational. And as I mentioned before, there's certain traits that are associated with women in politics and tend to be associated, you know, again, novelty, change, modernity, moral integrity, and sort of feminine leadership. There's many and you could also maybe think of in some contexts, it seems that women in politics are associated with peace. That could be another trait in some countries that women in politics are associated with. But basically, gendered incentives has to be when these party selectors have a goal and they think that they need those specific traits in particular in order to achieve that goal, in order to win the election, improve the party brand, or improve their legacy. So, for example, in the case of parties that are facing corruption scandals, they're worried about how am I going to convey to voters, right, moral integrity? How can I recover the party brand in that, and how can I convince voters that they can trust us? And we see not only in Latin America, but in other parts of the world too, that party selectors may have incentives then to nominate a woman for president, and also women at lower levels of government as well. So that would be an example of having an incentive that is that could move party selectors when they normally always go for men, right? They normally always tend to nominate men for president, but it can give them sort of a push, a motivation that to nominate a woman
Awesome. Jennifer, you put something in the chat. I wanted you to bring
Well,
it
no,
to the camera.
I didn't want to derail your questions, right? But I was just
No,
thinking like,
it's
oh, we
okay.
can come back to this. No, but
Yes.
Catherine, I didn't want to cut you off.
No,
Okay.
that's totally fine.
No, I mean, listening to Catherine talk, I mean, first of all, Catherine is 1,000% right. So there are these gender traits, right, that attach to women, and party selectors can perceive that these traits are useful for the strategic context of the election and the long-term, strategic goals of the party. And that is often what we see. But, I'm sitting here thinking about so many of the as Catherine is talking about this theory that I've heard before, and again, she is correct. But I'm sitting here thinking about all of the questions I've been asked by journalists this week, and about the two women in the race, but now about sort of a future President Sheinbaum, right? President-elect Sheinbaum in Mexico. And I'm also thinking about, these gender traits theoretically explain what happens, right? How women become nominated and how women win, but then they also become, in practice, these double-edged swords for women, right? Because then if women leaders do not, and this is a bit, if women leaders then don't seem to take a different path once they're in office, right? They don't seem to make a break with politics as usual. They perpetuate the same old politics. And they, unlike men, carried into office this gendered assumption just by virtue of being a woman that they would be different, they would be novel, they would be change agents. And then that doesn't happen. Then there's often a disproportionate backlash against the women leaders. They are much more likely to be perceived as having been ineffective. But of course, this is a gendered assumption, right? We use this to explain theoretically what's happening, but women politicians actually are not necessarily agents of change because they're inheriting the exact same political environment as all as the men candidates before them, right? They don't get a new political scenario just because they're women, but they carry these disproportionate expectations about what they can achieve because they're women. And then they sort of face this disproportionate backlash when they don't achieve it, right? So I've been asked all week long, what will Claudia Sheinbaum do to fight organized crime? Now, that's an extremely important question. Organized crime and insecurity is number one issue, right, for Mexican voters and for Mexico as a country. But what I've been pointing out is that the past 4 men presidents have all had different strategies for fighting organized crime, and they have all not succeeded, right? So maybe there is some fifth strategy out there that would actually reduce organized crime in Mexico. But this is a really complex scenario, right? And I think, of course, Sheinbaum, like any male president before her, should be accountable for whether or not she succeeds in lowering organized crime because of the salience of this policy issue. But the question for me is, are we expecting her to somehow do this newly or better or different because she's a woman? And will we disproportionately penalize her when she does not, keeping in mind that the past 4 men also failed, right, at doing this? So I think now looking forward, right, we have to think about how these gender traits then become different evaluative mechanisms that hold women leaders to different standards.
Could I add to what Jennifer's saying, just to pull that out even more? So when we talk about specifically the trait of moral integrity being associated with women in presidential politics, like as Jen, was saying, that this eventually could help women get elected, right? But then we have a difference in expectations. And so so this is where the double-edged sword comes in as well, I think, with what Jen is saying, particularly with that trait, because then they think, oh, because she's a woman, we should nominate her because she can help us signal moral integrity. Voters think, oh, she's a woman, so she'll be more less likely to be corrupt. She's, not from these old networks, this old establishment. Ideas of maternalism as well can play into this, right? That mothers are supposed to be moral beacons, right? Versus men. Then once they get to office, right? And presidents, in Latin America in general, at some point they're going to face a scandal. And at some point that, corruption is going to happen in the executive branch as well. And so there has been studies on this. The first thing is that women presidents, not only in Latin America, but also outside of Latin America, tend to have lower approval ratings than men. Once you control for, you hold constant the economic performance, for example, holding constant crime, et cetera, they tend to have lower approval ratings. And so one of the questions is, why is this happening? And we've also seen in statistical studies, right, that once a president is implicated in sort of a scandal, or once corruption in the executive branch starts to rise, voters tend to punish women presidents more than men presidents. And how do they punish them? By lowering their approval ratings. And so the women's approval ratings in that sense are sort of more sensitive, we could say, to scandals. And it has to do with, you know, what Jen was saying before, is that you have this stereotype that is a double-edged sword. It can help women get nominated, get elected, but then once they become implicated, as many presidents are, right? We can sort of see this double standards at play. And I'm thinking just example for Michelle Bachelet's, right? She had a great first term as president of Chile. She ended her presidency with 80% approval rating, you know, the most popular president we've ever seen in Chile. She comes back a few years later, wins re-election by an overwhelming amount. Couple years or so into her second term, her son is implicated, and her daughter-in-law are implicated in sort of a scandal. And although she doesn't have direct, she was not directly implicated in this, but there came up this idea that, oh, she's a mother. Every mother, you know, knows exactly what their son's doing, what their daughter-in-law is doing. And, you know, after that scandal, which didn't directly implicate her, but her son, her daughter-in-law, that's when we really saw her public approval ratings dive. And unfortunately, they never came back, right? Unfortunately for her, right? They never came back. And so we've seen other, you know, male presidents, right, implicated in scandals that haven't had that kind of impact, which we think is gendered too. Something similar happened with Dilma Rousseff, right, as president, implicated in a scandal. Indirectly, more related to her management of the economy and finances, and she ended up, right, being impeached. And her predecessor, right, the current president, not only comes back and wins again the presidency while she ends up impeached. And so, and he was implicated in other scandals prior to this. And so we see men presidents are able to sort of survive these things. And so why is that? And again, we just tend to think that could be during the campaigns as well. There's these generated expectations and excitement over what Jen was saying, this change, and also excitement of maybe these women can really clean up corruption. And actually, Dilma Rousseff's first term, her first year was pretty great because she was firing a lot of ministers who were implicated in these corruption scandals, and she had quite high approval ratings. I think that they reached 70% at one point. She was quite popular in that first year when she's able to meet those expectations. And then when she's not, then she's doubly, in a sense, punished for that. So that it'd be interesting to see, you know, how this sort of plays out in Mexico, where corruption is obviously an important issue as well.
I mean, when you all were talking about the double, I'm so sorry, but when you all were talking about the double-edged sword and just that answer, I literally got chills because as we celebrate and as we, you know, a woman is president, what they're inheriting and also how they're judged, you know, for that is just, you're correct. It's just not okay. And so I wanted to ask before we move on to Georgina, because you all have provided a wealth of information and answered most of our questions. So thank you so much. But you not only did you answer most of our questions, but you dived into something that needs to be discussed in the public relations and how men receive the accolades for supporting a man. I mean, it's for supporting a woman president, but then also get, you know, have the ability to break the rules. I love that. And so what should we learn about Claudia Scheinbaum's? Oh, and Fatma has some questions too. Fatma, I'm going to send it back over to you when I'm done. But what should we learn from, not what we're learning, what we're celebrating, but what do you think we should learn from Claudia Scheinbaum's election? And what do you think it is? What do you think the ripple effect will be internationally after, you know, now that she's been elected in this historic election in Mexico, and also the other women that are elected? But what should we really learn beyond the pomp and circumstance? What's the real lesson that we need to pay attention to?
Well, I think there was a few things that was really exciting about this race, and then about Sheinbaum's victory. And actually, it was not the first time we've had two women go head to head for the presidency in Latin America, right? Catherine can tell you that I believe the first time was in Chile when Michelle Bachelet competed against Evelyn Matei. But of course, Mexico, at least in the United States, captures a bit more attention than Chile. And so this was a very eye-opening race. There were a few things that were exciting about the race. Both the candidates were, no matter your particular policy preferences for one candidate or another, right? But both candidates were really extremely decorated women, both professionally and politically, right? So there were some positives. That there was not a strong narrative in any of sort of the mainstream or serious Mexican press about whether these women were qualified for the job, right? Both Claudia Sheinbaum and Xochitl Galvez had extremely important offices. Claudia as mayor of Mexico City, Galvez as a former cabinet member for former President Vicente Fox, and then a senator, right? So Sheinbaum holding a doctorate in energy engineering, Galvez being a tech entrepreneur, very well known in business and tech circles in Mexico City. So no conversations about qualifications, which is one of the things that usually gender and politics scholars would say, is that women are held to higher standards for their qualifications than men. But both of these women were so decorated in their professional and political lives, that was off the table. And I think that was really exciting to see two very qualified, competent women, and then not have their qualifications or their competence be discussed, right? So I think that is really exciting. And we started off by saying that, gender quotas and gender parity don't apply to unitary offices like the presidency, but that is still the glass ceiling. That's the most important executive office, right? The most important office, the executive office. And so now there's no young girl in Mexico who doesn't think that she could be a presidential candidate or a president, right? So that final glass ceiling has been shattered. And I do think the logic of gender quotas and gender parity and the progression that Mexico was on, I do think that played a role in setting up this all-female race and delivering a female victor, because I think it incentivized the opposition to nominate a woman to confront Sheinbaum as the presumptive nominee of the governing coalition, even before Sheinbaum, triumphed in her primary. And so I think, right, the opposition sort of thought, well, if they're going to run a woman, we're going to do it too. We're actually going to, and they neutralize some of those conversations that you usually see, as Catherine said, where one party gets to claim it's the change agent by putting forward the woman candidate, and the other party can't claim that, right? Both parties, right, sort of staked their ground. So I think there's a really important symbolic victory for young women and all of Mexico. And I also want to point out, Mexico is a member of the G20. There is only currently one woman leader in the G20. That's Giorgia Meloni, who's the Prime Minister of Italy. So when Sheinbaum assumes her position, then there will be two women in the G20. That actually tells us something about how rare it still is to see a woman as chief executive, and how rare it is to see a woman as a chief executive of the so-called more powerful countries, right? I put that in quotes. We have to be sensitive, but the G20, right, is there because these are supposed to be 20 of the most important economies in the world. So to start having another woman in the space of the G20, to have a woman who is leading foreign policy for the United States' most important trading partner, and a significant partner for the United States on a variety of other issues, immigration and security. These are really important international spheres for signaling as well. And so I think it's exciting that Mexico will get to do that.
I have a couple loose ends that I was thinking of sort of addressing. But when Jen was talking about these two woman candidates, yes, that is cool for Mexico. Unfortunately, I'm trying to think of the other examples of when you have two women like front runners, you could say, or in systems where you have two rounds of voting, two women in the second round, right, would be relevant as well. And from what I can sort of see here is that you tend to get two women front runners maybe when there's a large margin of victory and it's pretty predictable what's going to happen. So I'm going back to Chile as well in 2013, when the right saw Michelle Bachelet she was coming back in for re-election after sitting out a term. It was clear she was going to win, and they sort of played hot potato a little bit with the presidential nomination among men. And there was a few men in the right who were coming in and then came out, and it finally ended up being a woman. And she lost, in the second round enormously to Michelle Bachelet. And here we see a clear, huge margin as well, that Claudia Sheinberg, we basically knew she was going to win several months ago. There was really, from what I could tell, not much of a competition. In the months preceding the election itself, from what public opinion polling was saying too. So it could unfortunately be the case that, once if the opposition party or the party in power as well sees that a woman is highly favored to win, then they might just put another woman up as maybe as like a Hail Mary. As well, or because they pretty much know they're going to lose, and so no men are really seeking necessarily nomination at that stage, and they're not fighting over it so fiercely, right? Because it's pretty clear that a woman's going to win. Unfortunately, I also wanted to just go back to this point that I think sometimes gets lost in the conversation about double standards and moral integrity. And so, I mean, we can think of it as like, oh, how unfair, right? That we have double standards for moral integrity. And I think there is something to that. But it's not that women are the problem, right? Here, we need to raise our standards of moral integrity and not lower them. And so I'm all in favor of punishing presidents for corruption and for scandals, provided there's a clear link, right? And it's clear that they were responsible for something. But this doesn't mean, it basically means that we need to raise standards for men presidents, and for men in politics in general. And so we can look at the glass, half empty or half full in that sense. And I think that we need to put the onus more on men when we're talking about those double standards. And just sort of being aware of it too, because some of these can come out in media discourse, can certainly propagate this. There's not so much evidence, that voters, for example, are biased against women, and that necessarily that they will always punish women more. But I do think the media plays a big role in this, in perpetuating stereotypes and perpetuating these double standards, and maybe not being hard enough on the men, right? When these corruption scandals come out. I was thinking about what Jen was saying too about really powerful countries and how it could be especially difficult for women to win presidential elections or become prime minister as well in those countries. And I do think that there is something to that. When we look at the world broadly, and Frida Jalazade is the scholar who really looked at this, women tend to come to power more often when executive power is divided. So when you have presidents who have less power, and for example, presidents of semi-presidential systems, but it's also easier for women to become prime ministers. And so it's particularly difficult, for example, in the presidencies, as what we see in Latin America, where presidents have enormous constitutional powers. And Latin American presidents, unlike the US president, right, sets a legislative agenda and makes laws. They deliver legislation to Congress, and they have much more resources, the presidents do, to draft bills, execute bills, et cetera, which is a little bit different from how it works in the US. And Latin American presidents also tend to have more appointment powers, so they don't need necessarily to have, for example, Senate approval for appointments. They have more unilateral powers in that way. And so thinking about Mexico and Brazil is also, we've seen a woman president there. These are exceptional. When we think about the US in particular, I think something that might be a little bit more particular about this case is that it's a country that historically has seen itself, right, as a world leader, and with an enormous military, a military power, a global military. And this could gender the presidency in particular ways in the case of the US. And some of these countries, the president international security is could be less of an issue. I'm thinking of countries that, Costa Rica, right? And countries that actually don't have militaries. And so the presidency may be gendered in a different way than we would see, for example, in the United States. But Mexico, like as Jen was saying, right, it's this domestic security that is a big issue. That we might have expected to have impeded the country from electing a woman president, but which was not the case. So it's groundbreaking in that sense as well.
Thank you. Fatma, you have some questions?
Yes, since we were talking about the US especially, so I have one big question about the US and turning back to gender quotas as well. We all know that there's no doubt that gender quota help the nomination and election of more women in national assemblies, the parliament, all of that. If you were at a congressional hearing and you have to advocate for gender quotas in the United States, what would you say? And what is the best design do you think that gender quota would help in the US and would appeal to political parties as well?
Well, Represent Women might not ever invite me back after I say this, but I explain to my students all day long, and my US students, I guess I'm in the UK now, but I explain to my US students all day long, or I used to, that the US that positions itself as exceptional is exceptional in ways that are actually quite hard for gender equality. And one of the ways that the US is unique is that in every single country that I have ever studied, so I don't want to say every single country across the globe because there are 200 and I might not know about a few, but in the vast majority of countries that I am aware of, right, the actual technical mechanism through which an individual becomes a candidate is that the party registers the candidates before the electoral authorities. So the US is exceptional in being the only or among the only countries where that is not how an individual becomes a candidate. In the United States, an individual becomes a candidate by registering themselves in front of the electoral authorities. Why does this matter for Represent Women never inviting me to come back and talk about gender quotas in the United States? Is because I've been studying for gender quotas for 20 years, and I don't actually know a way to apply a gender quota in the United States, even if there was political will, because of that tactical difference. Because in every other country, when it is parties that register candidates, what gender quotas and gender parity are regulations. Technically speaking, they are regulations on parties' candidates' registries, that when parties go to the electoral authorities and they say, this is my list of candidates for the election, right? They have to have the certain numbers of women. Now, yes, there are also mechanisms where independent candidates can self-register, right? But in most cases, we're talking about party candidates, and parties do the registration. And so therefore, parties have to comply with the quota or the parity rule at the moment of registration. So even if we had political will or interest in the United States, which we don't, I don't know of a mechanism to have a quota because parties in the United States do not control candidate selection. The party can signal in a primary who its preferred candidate is and whom they would like to run. But because candidates self-register and candidates choose the party label, the party has no mechanism to prevent people from running with that party label. So as I tell my students, I could, when I lived in Los Angeles, right, I could walk down to the Los Angeles County Election Authority, right, and I could say, I, Jennifer Piscopo, am running for this seat in Congress as a Republican. And the Republican Party could look at me and they could say, well, that's bananas. She doesn't agree with anything we agree with. But because I can self-register as long as I meet the requirements, the Republican Party has no way to stop me from appearing on the ballot as Jennifer Piscopo, Republican candidate, right? So this is a technical answer, but I do think it's important because I don't want people to spend a lot of time in the United States fighting for something that just won't work with our election system. But there are other really important mechanisms that help level the playing field for women in politics in the United States. Money, campaign funding, because money matters enormously in many countries, but especially in the United States. And one of the key changes that I like to highlight is it was only very recently that the US Federal Electoral Commission allowed childcare to be considered an eligible campaign expense, right? So things like that, right? Recognizing that when women run for office, they might need to spend the money that's coming in on different things. Things like that can help enormously. And so let's put our energy into those mechanisms, because those actually fit with the system in the United States.
I don't have anything to add to that.
And Jennifer, we promise we'll invite you back. We promise we'll
Okay,
invite
okay.
you back.
I know you want, I know everyone wants gender quotas in the United States, and I would love them. They're just don't have I mean, we should make a big electoral reform and fix a lot of things about our elections, and then we could add a quota.
Right.
And that's why we're advocating for represent women. Actually, not only gender quota, we want all reforms.
Yes.
Well, I guess could I just ask Jen a little bit of follow up on that?
Sure.
But couldn't you do this at the state level? And that's what I'm not. I'm just wondering, like, could there be a pathway where some, and maybe in states where there is political will to have gender quotas, could they start?
I don't know if you could, because candidates can always self-register, right? So you could require I guess you could require, I don't know if you could do it at the state level, right?
Maybe there's innovation there that
but maybe we could come back and talk about that separately, because I know I don't want to get bogged down.
Thank you. Fatma, did you have any more questions?
No, we can move to Georgina. Thank you.
Okay, welcome, Georgina. I know you joined a little bit
Thank
late.
you.
So
I'm sorry, guys. I'm
welcome.
sorry for joining in late. I apologize. And I'm sorry for missing Jennifer and Catherine's remarks. Thank you. I'm very grateful for being included in this conversation. I'm a big fan, Jennifer, Catherine. So thank you very much. And just going straight into it, Catherine, you were talking about punishments and the punishments that women politicians face that are disproportionate, also in the same line as Jennifer was talking about disproportionate backlash. And I was just thinking, thinking about this election in Mexico, and also thinking about last year, we had two local elections in Mexico. And it was particularly the biggest state, the biggest electorate in the country is in the state of Mexico. With over, what is it, about 14 million electors in that state. And we saw that it was the lowest turnout in the history of the state. And, you know, I was just thinking about it, and that was an all-women race, right? And now thinking about this election in Mexico, I mean, it was not a bad turnout. It was a little bit over 60%, but it was lower than the previous two presidential elections. So have you or Jennifer, in any of your research or observations, found a correlation between turnout and having women or an all-women race?
Sure.
Have you seen anything regarding that? And on the other hand, I wanted to ask Jennifer, you know, you spoke about disproportionate backlash. We've seen in recent years, not only in Mexico, mainly the United States, obviously, but in other countries as well, different elements of backsliding in terms of democracy in general, right? And how electors value democracy. Do you think that, you know, part of this disproportionate backlash of, you know, having a woman president and, you know, not meeting everyone's expectations or super high expectations because she's a woman? You spoke recently about women not necessarily producing feminist utopias. I read your work regularly. So do you think this will generate, in case, you know, she doesn't perform, Sheinbaum doesn't perform as everyone is expecting, that would generate a backlash against, the public's acceptance of parity and quotas as, necessary for our democratic system. Not easy questions, I assume,
No,
but
Catherine,
yeah.
do you want to talk first about the turnout?
Sure. Yeah, so this is how I would approach that. Jen and co-authors has a study on this, and I found the similar phenomenons with presidential candidacies. But the basic question is, when do parties nominate women? So when might you see an all-woman race, right? And what we see in Latin America is that they tend to do so. As we know, when selectors want change. But when do selectors want to signal change? When things are going badly. Okay, so when party identification is falling and when trust in parties is falling. I suspect that if you have those kinds of circumstances, parties not only will start nominating women more, have greater incentives to do so, but it also might be a situation when you do see lower turnout because people are identifying less with parties and are less energized about politics in general. So I don't think that it's the voters are not turning out because they don't like women. I don't think that's the case. So we have lots of survey work and survey experimental work, right, on this, when it basically shows that voters are not biased against women in general, not only in Latin America, but in many parts of the world, even parts of the world where you would think that there would be bias against women, it doesn't seem to be the case. So the idea that, an all-woman race that depresses turnout, the causal logic is different there. Okay, it's that the women probably got there in the first place because those selectors thought they needed to signal change, and they thought that women could help them do that. And as you know, we know that not necessarily having a woman candidate is going to inspire the masses to turn out or necessarily vote for them. As well, they have voters have similar preferences for men and women in many cases. So there, and I certainly would be worried if the parties thought, oh my gosh, we're nominating women and now people are not turning out, and maybe they, well, I guess if you're having an all-woman election, then a woman will be elected in that sense. But women aren't the problem there. It's simply that the selection is in times that are they're a symptom in that sense of maybe broader disaffection with political parties. I don't know if that makes sense, Georgina.
I'm also thinking, Catherine, what you said too about we tend to have all women races when one party is already seeming to be a dominant or likely victor, right? Because the electorate isn't divided 50-50. The electorate is, super majority one way and minority the other way. And those are also situations that depress turnout, right? So when voters perceive that the victor is already a foregone conclusion, they are much less likely to turn out because they perceive that their vote matters less. But I think this is an interesting empirical question. And Georgina, I know you're also moonlight as an academic, so maybe that is our next project, is now that we have enough all women executive races, thanks to parity and everything, we could actually test empirically what is happening here. I can talk about the Democratic backsliding, but I know I jumped in, Catherine, so I didn't know if you had anything else you wanted to add.
Oh, just to go along with what you're saying is that exactly that is what happened in Chile in 2013 in the second round, right? You had really low turnout in that second round when it was clear that Bachelet was going to win and she was competing against another woman. And so that is another example, I think, of maybe what Georgina was referring to. And as Jen is saying, it could be based on the lopsidedness of the election and that people see it as predetermined in a sense, obvious that she's going to win.
We'll watch this space. We'll have to come back and talk about our research paper now that Georgina's come up with this great hypothesis. Okay, so I think the Democratic backsliding conversation and the relationship between Democratic backsliding and women leaders is really complicated. I think there's a unique spin in the Mexican case. So let me talk about the Mexican case, and then, if we have time, we can go to the bigger picture. So I think I think Sheinbaum has a variety of governance challenges, and I think she has a variety of ways that her actions are going to be perceived, and I think they could be perceived in gender terms. And one of the challenges, right, is that Morena, the political reforms, the electoral reforms, the economic reforms that were initiated by now outgoing President Andrés Manuel López Obrador have been highly controversial in Mexico. right? And they have been accused with substantial amounts of reason for perhaps being undemocratic in certain of their intentions and certain of their effects, right? So in my academic research, I talk about Morena as being a party on the populist left, contrasting the populist left with the democratic left, and saying there are actions of President Lopez Obrador and of the party that could have consequences for the long-term democratic health of Mexico. So now what has happened? The polls going into the Mexican election dramatically underestimated the vote for Morena. So even though, as Catherine said, it was clear that Morena and therefore Claudia would win, right? The polls had the margin off. And even I was saying the eve before the election, and frequently what happens when you do media is you have to go back and eat your words. So here's me eating my words. I was saying the night before the election, I think Xochitl Galvez is going to close within 10 points of Claudia Sheinbaum. I said that to major international outlets. I was extremely wrong.
I said the same thing. Yeah, we were all
I was
surprised.
extremely
It was
wrong. The
crazy.
margin was double that in the opposite direction. Okay, so let's go back to the democracy question. So voters, the polls dramatically underestimated support for Morena. I think that's because the kind of Morena voter who is much more likely to be structurally marginalized due to socioeconomic status, right, was just not in the polls, right? But voters handed, even with low turnout, voters handed a clear mandate to Morena and to President-elect Sheinbaum for the legacy of Lopez Obrador to continue. So now Sheinbaum is in an extremely awkward spot, right? She has been handed a clear mandate. This mandate has been criticized for having anti-democratic elements, and many of those criticisms are not unjustified, right? And she's a woman. Okay, so now there's an interesting scenario here, right? Where on the one hand, you have the voters have spoken. They spoke quite clearly, more clearly than any analyst thought they would, about what they want the future of Mexico to be. And that is part of democracy, right? Is recognizing electoral mandates. On the other hand, right, another part of democracy is respecting checks and balances and competition, despite what voters want. So now the new president has to navigate this tightrope. And because the polls underestimated support for Morena, she has a congressional majority. So actually, she could break, right? Clearly on the side of continuing Lopez Obrador's legacy, and the congressional majority and the electoral mandate give her the green light to do that. I think there's a gendered perception that we haven't talked about yet, which is because women frequently win the presidency through being the nominees of popular incumbent parties, where a key selector in those popular incumbent parties is an outgoing man who wants to, have a woman as part of his legacy. These women are then often seen as the puppets of men. There's already a conversation, right, going on about, is Sheinbaum her own person? Now, that is a legitimate question, given the context of Morena as a dominant, populist, and potentially anti-democratic party, but it also has these gendered connotations, right? And now you add in the scenario of the clear mandate from voters, whether you like it or not, to continue Lopez Obrador's project. And I think Sheinbaum is in this very tough position now relative to the future of democracy, relative to how her actions for the future of Mexican democracy become perceived. And if she becomes perceived as anti-democratic, would she be disproportionately judged harshly for being anti-democratic relative to a bunch of anti-democratic men that are in power right now? Because she's a woman, and as Catherine's been saying, we expect women to be more democratic, right? We expect them to be more consensus seeking, more collegial, more respectful of difference and diversity. So if Sheinbaum governs more like an autocrat, that could also be read through gender terms. So I think this is just complicated for Mexico. And it is a little different from what we observe globally, right? Because what we observe globally is that the vast majority of would-be authoritarian leaders are men. Often, right, they have a very explicit stance against gender equality, against having powerful women in leadership. That's almost part of their brand, right? And so we do often associate democratic backsliding with a reduction in women's political power, because often what autocrats do, right, is reduce political pluralism and reduce gender equality. That's not where Mexico is. Mexico's in a bit of a unique position here.
Could I?
Just to add on that, I fear sometimes, with the parity in everything mandate, we now have a female head of our elections agency, and we have a female head of our electoral court, right? So, in terms of this election, it's been frequently like at least the head of our independent elections agency, her independence has been questioned throughout this election, right? So, and now Claudia's independence from her predecessor is obviously being questioned at this point. So my fear is that in terms of public perception of how useful parity is, and quote, how useful quotas are for ensuring that women actually get to decision-making positions, in terms of public perception, how that's going to turn out at the end, having what the Mexican experience will turn out to be with parity in everything, is very dependent on these trailblazers, on the first women who get to play these roles. And what I fear is that, next thing you know, it's going to be like, oh, that's why you wanted to get there, so you can mess everything up. That's what I constantly fear, that is going to be the public perception of, our first, female head of the elections agency. She's, in case of the electoral court, she's not the first, but, the first female president. Like, why did we want to get there in the first place? And I think we're not talking about that enough. And that is my fear at the end of the day. I just wanted to share that with the group.
I think so. And I think the reason we have to keep, recording these interviews and putting them up online is to try to, is to try to correct that narrative, right? So, I'm already working on my talking points for Scheinbaum's first 100 days. And so when they turn around and they say, well, Scheinbaum has turned out not to be independent of Lopez Obrador, she's just following what Lopez Obrador wanted her to do, I'm going to say, because over 60% of Mexican voters gave her a mandate to do that, right? So again, we've got, no matter whether you like it or not, I am not making a normative endorsement for Morena's policies or Lopez Obrador's policies, but we've got to start thinking about how do we push back against that narrative, right? So Scheinbaum got a mandate. So if she is going to continue Morena's legacy, she can be criticized on policy grounds for that, but that doesn't mean she's not independent. The voters spoke, right? Like, so I think we have to kind of fight back against these narratives, right?
Loud and clear.
We have to fight back against them. But yeah, Catherine, I don't know if you have any other insights.
Well, it's simply that women, when they win these elections democratically, they don't act as puppets. And there's very few examples, right? When they have that popular vote, that popular mandate. Bachelet was certainly not the puppet of Ricardo Lagos. The clearest example, is Dilma Rousseff, and Lula was more popular than AMLO was when he left office, right? Dilma still, in some things, didn't always do what Lula would have done. And so even though they were very like-minded and very much on the same page in terms of policy, even in that case, she was her own independent person. And I'm sure she talked with Lula and conversed with him. But if you look at these, women presidents, there's very little evidence of them acting as puppets. I would not expect that in this case as well. Particularly,
it does seem like I'm going to make Georgina even more gloomy. It does seem like we're back to those double standards, right? Because on the one hand, either the women continue the legacy of the incumbent and they're perceived as puppets, and on the other hand, there are many ways in which they don't act as puppets, but then they get criticized for that. right? So I'm thinking about, Laura Chinchilla, who exactly followed this path that you theorize, right? Catherine, she was elected president of Costa Rica. She was the protege of the outgoing president, Oscar Arias. So she was his protege. That was in a popular incumbent party. She wins the election. She turns into such her own person following the election. She has a public break with him and he reacts, right, partially in this gendered way, because the shock of the fact that the woman would then not be grateful to him and develop her own agenda. And then they have a public fight and he withdraws his support for her presidency. And this hobbles her going forward, right? So now I think we're back in this terrible gender bind, right? Where it's like, on the one hand, if women are perceived as puppets, that's bad. But if they try to establish independence, they also are perceived as being, ungrateful or uncontrollable, right? Or unpredictable. And so, oh no, I've depressed myself again.
We can never get it right. Thank you very
All
much.
right.
Thank you very much for answering my questions.
Thank you, Georgina.
I feel like we should end on a bit more of a hopeful note. Catherine?
Yes, yes, please.
I was going to say any final thoughts, so maybe we can go back.
The only thing that we didn't quite touch on is, a little bit, right, and how women use their power, but if we look at women presidents in general, there's a lot of variation in how they use their presidential power and how much they innovate in their use of power. But the one area where it does seem that sort of make a difference is on these gender equality issues. And that's for two reasons, right? That these women presidents, when they're candidates, they often promise pro-women change and pro-women reforms and try to mobilize women on the basis of gender identity, which I think that you did see, in Mexico, right? You certainly saw that in Chile and in some other countries as well. So they can have incentives to use their power to promote change favoring women. And also we tend to see women presidents nominate more women to their cabinets as well. So that'll be interesting to see in the case of Claudia Sheinbaum, what's her first cabinet going to look like. And we didn't touch on that so much, but in general, when women have enough power to be able to appoint their cabinets unilaterally, they tend to appoint more women, at least at the beginning of their term.
Well, Georgina, would you say that parity and everything means she has to have a gender parity cabinet, right?
She does. Yeah, she would have to. But it was interesting yesterday. She tweeted out a photo of, she was sort of in a meeting or something, and it was a whole group of people, and she tweeted something like, so this is our team, we're getting ready to work in the transition or whatever, and then it's only one other woman, and it was very disappointing, and I even retweeted that, and I was like, this does not look good. You're our first female president. It would be very disappointing if that turns out to be the case, but yeah, she's legally obligated to have at least half of her cabinet members be women. Yeah.
And, there's a lot of questions about, will having a woman president in Mexico make a difference for the femicide rates? Will it make a difference for violence against women? And I think it's important, again, to think about complications, right? It's not that you elect a president and then men stop killing a woman president and then men stop killing women, right? That's not how this works.
Right.
But, to Catherine's point about gender equality change, it's also important to think about not all changes and policies that are made by women presidents are necessarily explicitly splashy and huge and framed around gender equality, but they can have enormous consequences for gender equality, even so. And so I'm thinking, for instance, there was a marvelous report in the Los Angeles Times about how Claudia Sheinbaum, as governor of Mexico City, actually initiated a lot of reforms that did lower crime and homicide rates, and that they were not from the AMLO playbook. And those were never explicitly framed in terms of gender equality, but we know, right, that lowering overall levels of criminality and homicide benefit women because women tend to experience more violence when crime is high and when levels of militarization and securitization are high. So I think there's also ways we can think about her work going forward, right, in ways that is nuanced, but also attentive to, you know, do you have an own goal when you miss those really important symbolic moments like you just indicated, Georgina? So we'll have to come back and do an evaluation halfway through her term.
I like another interview 100 days in. Like, why don't we just sign up and we can have a part two to this
Do they do,
conversation?
I mean, I feel like I know a lot about Mexican pot, but Georgina, is the 100 days, does that resonate in Mexico?
It's a thing.
Does in the
Yeah,
US?
it's
A
totally a
thing. All
thing.
right, let's do it.
Let's
do it.
do it. So we'll come back for part two of this conversation. I really want to say thank you to you all. This is the first that we've ever done this, to have a conversation on a recorded conversation on an international election where we come and we bring questions and thought leaders and scholars. And so more to come. I'm excited about the part two. I thank you for taking time out of your day. And we will, of course, send you the links and the YouTube links and the website links so that you can have this conversation. But again, thank you so much for taking time
Thank
out
you.
and sharing your wealth of knowledge. And I'm excited about part two. I'm going to schedule it. So
Okay, all right. Thank you so much. Have a great
much.
Friday.
Ashley. Thank you.
Have a
Fatma.
good
Nice meeting
one.
you.
Thank you. Thank you, Fatma.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye, Georgina. Thank you.